Hi, I'm Sara.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode titled Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sara. What movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Becket. Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of alcohol abuse, violence, attempted sex trafficking. On the note of violence, swords going through people. Can you think of anything else?
There is some fork violence also.
Yes. People stabbing people with forks 100 years before anyone in Europe would have actually had a fork.
I would also like to add another trigger warning, which is trigger warning for anyone who gets upset by incredibly detailed history. That's the episode tonight.
I was so excited about this one because Eleanor of Aquitaine has been a heroine of mine since middle school. I'm obsessed with the early Plantagenets, and that is the area that we're in tonight.
These are wild times.
I know.
And Rena, can you please give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We spoil everything, and we enjoy it.
Excellent. Some of the sources we used in this episode include articles from The Guardian, from FIT's Fashion History, from the website Frockflix, and also Peter O'Toole, The Definitive Biography by Robert Sellers. Thomas Becket, Warrior, Priest, Rebel, a 900-year-old story retold by John Gee. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a biography by Marion Mead. Tales from the long 12th century, The Rise and Fall of the Angevin Empire by Richard Hustroff.
Yes, this movie also contains an extreme amount of what I call eyeball sex between men.
This is the gayest movie we watched during Pride Month.
And this was not a Pride Month film. I remember when you watched this, you asked me, Rena, how was this movie not included in Pride Month?
This is one gay movie.
So, Sara, can you please tell us a little bit about Thomas Becket and the 1964 film Becket? And we are still having Sara do her normal routine of doing the abbreviated Wikipedia, because the problem is that while I could rattle this off, at least about Becket off the top of my head, I will wind up spending 20 minutes on tangents talking about the anarchy and the White Ship disaster and all of Eleanor of Aquitaine's children by her two husbands before saying anything about Thomas Becket. So it's better to let Sara do the abbreviated version.
I feel like one of my roles this evening is to play a firm-handed moderator. So, Thomas Becket, from our friends at Wikipedia, also known as St. Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas of London, and later Thomas Becket, approximately 1119 or 1120 through December of 1170, served as Lord Chancellor from 1155 to 1162, and then notably Archbishop of Canterbury from 1162 until his death in 1170. He engaged in conflict with Henry II, King of England, over the rights and privileges of the church and was murdered by followers of the king in Canterbury Cathedral. Soon after his death, he was canonized by Pope Alexander III. He is venerated as a saint and martyr by the Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion. And then on the film Becket, Becket is a 1964 British historical drama about the historic, tumultuous relationship between Henry II of England and his friend turned bishop Thomas Becket. It is a dramatic film adaptation of the 1959 play Becket, or The Honor of God by Jean Anouilh, was directed by Peter Glenville and produced by Hal B. Wallace with Joseph H. Hazen as executive producer. Budget was $3.1 million and the film grossed $9 million. Very different time in movies, clearly. Becket won the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, was nominated for 11 other awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and twice for Best Actor for Burton and O'Toole, and also for Best Supporting Actor for John Gielgud, which, like, whatever on that. I'll get to that performance. So we might as well jump right into the action here.
Indeed, but there are some interesting stories about drunk people from the making of this film. I had heard a story in particular about the production of Becket, where on an episode of Mark Maron's podcast, What the Fuck, Malcolm McDowell, who later starred in Caligula with Peter O'Toole, and for this you can listen to episode 3 on Caligula, he mentioned a story that he'd heard that Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, who were both legendary drunks of their generation in Hollywood, had agreed to stay sober for the filming. So they did this except on the last day when they went out and got hammered and then collapsed on set. But this is not what actually happened. And for the story of what really happened, I will be referring to Peter O'Toole, the definitive biography by Robert Sellers, where it records, clearly aware of the other's reputation for hell-raising and boozing, the two actors called a truce until they had acclimated sufficiently to each other and to their respective roles. The film crew, expecting the typhoon to pass through the usually tranquil Shepperton Studios when filming began in the summer of 1963, were left scratching their collective heads as O'Toole and Burton sat quietly between takes, sipping tea and doing crosswords. After 10 days, it was abundantly clear that both actors had the desired on-camera rapport, and putting on his best Irish accent, which I will make no attempt to do, I can't do an Irish accent, Burton said, "Peter, me boy, I think we deserve a little snifter." They drank for 2 nights and a day. After that, Glenville had his work cut out, keeping his stars under control. It was not unknown for them to appear on set intoxicated. On a scene where Henry places a ring upon Becket's finger, making him Chancellor of England, O'Toole could barely focus. It was rather like trying to thread a needle wearing boxing gloves, Burton recalled. For an opulent banquet, O'Toole arrived having drunk solidly for 12 hours. Often they drank in the small smattering of pubs located near the studio, such as the Hovel. This eccentric landlord displayed his appendix in a bottle on the bar, along with a shrunken head and a pickled penis. There is also the King's Head, where the landlord, Archie, would greet them with, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this leg of pork." Off. There were wild lunches lasting hours, full of hearty quaffing of champagne and brandy and verbal fencing, both men lobbing Shakespeare soliloquies at each other. One morning, O'Toole arrived in Burton's dressing room with an open bottle of whiskey in his hand. Burton declined it and asked what he was celebrating. "It's an Irish birthday." "And what day is that?" asked Burton. "Any day I say it is." O'Toole drained the bottle in 10 swigs and fell flat on his back. Shooting resumed 24 hours later. One more here. Future cult film director Brian Trenchard Smith remembers being invited to Shepperton as part of the Wellington College Film Circle and spending several hours wandering around the set and watching Glenville directing. In one scene, he remembers O'Toole replacing a nude actress under a blanket in his bed with a compliant Miss Elizabeth Taylor just before the cameras rolled. When he pulled back the sheet, revealing a beaming Liz, Burton didn't find it as amusing as the rest of the crew. Okay, Sarah, what do you think of this?
What a couple of douchebags. I'm sorry. That's not fun. I'm just imagining, there's a time in life where I probably would have been delighted by this. That time is over. I am also a little impressed that they were able to finish a product and do so in a way that was successful enough to garner all of these Academy Award nominations. I mean, that's not nothing. But man, what a nightmare.
That really does sound like a nightmare to work with.
Pranks cost money.
Mm-hmm. That wasn't even clever pranking. That was just two guys getting drunk a lot at inopportune times.
Well, and I'm thinking also of like the hiding Elizabeth Taylor under the blanket to surprise Richard Burton's. That costs money. Someone had to reset the lights. I'm so not fun anymore. Some poor line producer was just sweating bullets for 10 weeks while these two douchebagged it up, being incredibly wasted on the set of this film. I'm going to share with you a number of misconceptions and questions I had about this movie throughout this conversation. But I will tell you, the first thing that shocked me is I was convinced that Peter O'Toole was playing Becket.
You couldn't tell Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton apart?
Oh, I could tell them apart. When the movie started, I saw clearly which one was which. I just, all these years, had thought that Peter O'Toole played Becket.
Why?
Yeah. So just the start of a series of misconceptions laid to waste for me. We open up on King Henry II ride in on his pony. I'm pretty sure he's drunk in this scene. I was trying to guess which scenes they were drunk in. Mm-hmm. And he's rocking a red cape. And he's kind of got dead eyes. And he has the Attila the Hun mustache. A little bit. Like he had the shaved spot right in the middle. And that right away I did not care for. And he goes into a church and kneels in front of what looks like Becket in carbonite, but it's his grave. And he starts talking to it. He's talking about doing penance. And can you explain to me what the fuck is happening?
Yes.
What is the deal with him doing penance? Like, what's the story there?
Well, you watched to the end of the film, right?
I did.
So Henry is in trouble because he told his knights the famous line, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And the knights all rode off to kill Becket. He has to do penance because his knights murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Okay. That's what I thought, but I wasn't 100 on whether he ordered it or just implied the ordering of.
That is an 850 odd year old mystery, because will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? Those aren't his exact words. Those are how they've come down to us in popular mythology. He could be taken seriously or not. There's leeway to say, oh no, I was just complaining. They shouldn't have taken me at my word. But they did. And there are different readings that you can do on this as to whether he actually wanted the knights to go murder Thomas Becket.
Got it.
When someone says, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, it's sometimes used as a passive-aggressive way of saying, like, please, will someone else get rid of this problem for me?
So then I guess my next question is, did he turn himself in for that? Or do the priests just whip him because he says that they need to whip him? Did he tell on himself?
Someone else higher up in the church, I believe, would have pronounced the sentence.
Okay, so those are my questions about that scene. Thank you for answering.
Because Becket was murdered, Henry is at risk of excommunication.
This is all very complicated. He is retelling the story of how he and Becket got to this place, to Becket's grave. And we go into a flashback to when they went whore chasing together. Remembering all the good times riding on horses together, sometimes on the same horse, And this was also fascinating to me because I don't know what people were using for birth control back in the day, but like, did he have a lot of illegitimate children?
He did. He had at least 9 children with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, and he had
Yeah.
many illegitimate children besides.
Thank you for answering that. So they have some cavorting and some adventures with a farm girl and go running away from that and kind of talk a little bit about the genesis of their friendship and how Henry made Becket noble so they could hang. And they start talking about being Normans and Saxons. And what the fuck is that?
So, the original inhabitants of the island of Great Britain, at least the England part, are the Britons. The Romans come in around the 1st century BC and take over. The Romans are in Great Britain for almost twice as long as the US of A has been a country, and then the Roman Empire starts to shrink and they leave. Around the 5th century, the Anglo-Saxons show up and take over for the Britons. In about 300 or 400 years after that, the Vikings show up, and that's who King Alfred is fighting. Normans are Vikings who had settled in France about a century and a half before William the Conqueror, who is Henry II's great-grandfather, shows up. So they are Normans. And in real life, Becket was a Norman. Within a couple generations of William the Conqueror, there were no Anglo-Saxons left in the nobility. Normans have taken over everything. But so far as I can see, it's just one group of Catholic white people and another group of Catholic white people. That is what they are talking about when they're talking about Anglo-Saxons and Normans, and they make Becket an Anglo-Saxon here, but he was actually a Norman, so they are grafting on a colonialism story where none exists.
Cool. So they have a meeting. There's a bunch of priests who show up at this wearing hoods and crosses, and he just like kind of does some kinging is how I described it in my notes. He like points at people and he says, you know, I need money to go fight this war. And then we have a scene here where the fork is introduced and no one knows what to do with it except Becket. So they're all like stabbing at each other and things. And Beckett's trying to explain, you eat with it. And no one really seems all that interested in doing that. And this is a through line in the film, which I thought was pretty amusing. And Henry wants money to fight the King of France. And my next question is, but why though?
So, a bunch of Henry's lands are actually in France, because Normandy is in France. Anjou, which he has through his father Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, is in France, and that's actually Eleanor's land. And one of the things that's remarkable about her is that 900 years later, we know her by her patrimony, by the lands that she held and her right to leave to her sons, not as Eleanor of whatever country she married off to.
It seems like they were always just kind of like, let's go to war.
If you want to Google Angevin Empire, it'll show you the extent of lands held at this time. But what you can see is that Henry governs a fair chunk of France, so why not grab more of it? So King Louis of France is Eleanor's ex-husband. She had 2 daughters with him, and they divorced because they were really incompatible, and she only had daughters with him. And when she married Henry, she was 11 years older than him. She was 30 and he was like 19. But she managed to churn out at least like 9 babies who made it through infancy, I believe. She was pregnant more often than every other year until she was in her early 40s. Slow start, but caught up.
I feel like they do a lot of like laying groundwork to kind of explain the relationship between Becket and Henry. They run across this man on a farm and he's mute and they're really shitty to him. They're speculating on whether he has ever even known love because he's so dirty and ugly looking now. And he has a daughter who O'Toole wants to capture and take for his court. And Becket kind of is like the cleanup guy afterward who tells them not to worry. And also you are getting the sense that Becket is the smartest dude in the kingdom. And we end up back at the castle, and Becket goes to visit Gwendolen, who is his Welsh girlfriend, who is being held captive by Henry II because of something that happened. We have a conversation about honoring something higher than yourself. Henry shows up and he gets that servant girl for Becket anyway and dangles her in front of him. And it's kind of a shitty move on Henry's part because he does this in front of Becket's ostensible girlfriend. I don't know what exactly their relationship was, but they seem to like hanging out and chatting. And then Gwendolen goes and kills herself. And Beckett's pretty much like, well, okay then. And then kind of wonders, should I find some sense of honor? Is there something higher than me that I should be being called to?
I think the kid who stabs at Becket was supposed to be a son of the man in the hovel. Henry acts as though he thinks he's doing this girl a favor because he asks Becket, well, if we take her away from here and keep her at the castle, will she stay pretty? Henry is clearly a lot to manage, and I wanted to throw in that people in his family had legendarily bad tempers, and I have it here from the biography Becket. To add a little context, Henry's chief weakness was his temper, which could flare up in seconds like a whirlwind. His favorite expletive, the one to which Becket would become accustomed, was par les yeux Dieu, by God's eyes, or when he was especially roused, by God's eyes and throat, or by God's eyes and testicles. Said Peter of Blois, quoting the Bible, the king's wrath is the harbinger of death. Entering the royal bedchamber every morning, Peter reports, he would first look at the king's face before daring to speak to him, afraid that anything he said might further inflame Henry if he was in a difficult mood. To speak to an angry prince, he confides, seems to me to be like casting fishing nets in a hurricane. He who does so, and will not wait until the storm is over, destroys himself and his nets. Normally, his wrath subsided as swiftly as it rose. If he bawled people out in the morning, he would carry on as if nothing had happened in the afternoon, especially if their failings had been for reasons beyond their control. Though often lenient toward honest opponents, he could not tolerate disloyalty or breach of trust. Disloyalty not only rankled, it caused him to brood. His tirades against traitors were legendary. He would shout and swear and throw things around the room, as at Caen in 1166, when he upbraided the Constable of Normandy, Richard de Ormuz, who had dared to speak in favor of someone with whom he had just quarreled. Burning with rage, he tore his hat from his head, undid his belt, hurled his cloak and the clothes he was wearing far away from him, tore the silken covering from the bed with his own hand, and began to eat the straw on the floor, as if he were sitting in a ditch.
He sounds cool.
Yeah. A couple things I noticed. First, that this effigy that they show of Becket at the beginning is way more realistic than anything they knew how to bake at the time. We know from descriptions what people looked like, if anyone wrote it down, but there's a 1,000-year gap where no one was doing realistic portraiture. Becket is shitty to Gwendolen. She can't help what Henry is doing, and they shorten this so that it seems like everything happens in a matter of weeks or months, when what you're actually seeing here is about 15 years. Becket and Henry didn't really become friends until after Becket had been appointed chancellor on the suggestion of that old Archbishop of Canterbury that you see talking at the beginning, whose name was Archbishop Theobald. And then he was chancellor for like 7 years before he became archbishop. But here it seems like he's only chancellor for about as long as it takes the stab wound in his hands to heal.
The way that they're positioning this is very much that Burton is kind of the shadow king, despite resentment of him because of this whole Saxon Norman thing. And King Henry II, I don't know if you're familiar with the animated Robin Hood from the 1970s, but he's very Prince John from the animated Robin Hood.
Prince John. So when you see the other little kids later in the film in armor like crashing around into each other, John was the youngest son. He would have been, I'm not sure if he even would have been like toddling next to them. The oldest kid that he talks to later, who he wants to have crowned early as Henry III, will die young, but Richard the Lion-Hearted and John are Henry's sons.
It's such a random chunk of like very old history, and I know it's important, but it's kind of wild that we have this biopic.
It's a legendary story of a bromance that went real sour.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we have this because I find the 20th century really boring, and I'm like so happy to get to go spend time in the 12th. Like, I am so sick of seeing stuff set in the 20th century, and I hadn't realized just how many biopics are.
So the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and Henry decides that the move is to make Becket the new Archbishop of Canterbury, because as it gets explained, Canterbury is almost its own place in terms of its power. It is essentially the Southern District of New York.
Canterbury is a big deal. Although one thing they get wrong later is they say kings are crowned at Canterbury, and no, they were already starting to crown kings at Westminster Abbey then, like you saw last year in the coronation. Nearly everyone since 1066 has been crowned at Westminster Abbey unless something was off that year. I actually went and read the list of places that were not Westminster where people were crowned, and there just wasn't enough basis for Henry to say Canterbury.
Becket's all, don't do this, do not do this. And Henry's all, no, I'm going to do this. And Becket has this very rapid conversion into becoming the greatest Archbishop of Canterbury ever. I had a huge problem with this because it does feel apropos of nothing. He has that conversation with Gwendolyn. He just sort of decides, like, I'm going to become the Canterburyest Canterbury that ever was. Oh boy, is Henry not into that.
Yeah, Henry thought that Becket would stay his guy. You'd already seen that, like, Becket does not feel good about a lot of what he's doing. He's an amoralist and a wit, and this changes, and the thesis for the rest of the film is that Henry loves Becket, but Becket is not capable of loving anything except perhaps for the honor of God, which I find a rather abstract notion. I liked it when they were being drunk misogynists and rampaging around on horses. I liked it when they were both contentedly sinning, and Becket becomes really boring after he finds God.
There's not even a moment where there's a blast of light or something that shows him making this shift. He just does it. That was the biggest problem I had with this.
One thing I noticed was that the priests and monks get tonsured, which is where they shave the circle on the head, and it's probably it has to be one of the least sexy hairdos ever created, and they're always careful to try to shoot Richard Burton from the side or from the front to not remind anyone that he now has this horribly unsexy haircut. Also, remember what I read about when he's trying to when Peter O'Toole has to put the chancellor's ring on his hand, and we saw that. And did you notice how they had to shoot from the back and shoot a hand putting the ring on the hand?
You could just tell that they were so messed up so often in this movie. Like, Peter O'Toole's eyes look dead at points. He got on that horse and I was like, dude, you probably shouldn't be on that horse.
But his diction is always flawless.
I'm very impressed by what they were able to accomplish given the amount of alcohol they seem to be consuming. But there are points where he's walking or you see his eyes in close up and you're like, he's drunk right now. Henry's not happy about this. And then we find out that there's a priest who maybe raped a girl, and then he was killed by one of Henry's friends. And this is not okay because priests are adherent to a different set of laws and different judgment than the normal people, which is to say that Becket is pissed off about this happening because he wants to move him to a different diocese in Boston rather than having him face punishment. I kept going, are you kidding me? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, I am all about separation of church and state. So I'm on Henry's side with this, even though I know that Henry is just about wanting more power for Henry. Up to the point that Becket becomes archbishop, he's for Henry accumulating power from the church, and then he flips.
Don't they have a problem solved here by having Henry's friend kill the priest? Because that shit got handled for you. My take was that by killing this priest in custody rather than handing him over to the church to be moved to a different diocese in the Boston area, they did Becket a favor because he doesn't have to deal with this now. But Becket doesn't see it that way. And we see him kneel down and pray out of nowhere.
I don't get where Becket is coming from. The only thing he's standing up for here is the power of the church, not anything good that anyone is doing.
It is a literally principled stance. That's all it is. And this actually brought us to my favorite scene in the movie, where Henry is playing with a ball in a cup, like the string attached to the ball. He's playing with that just like a real king would. And his mother, Matilda, and Eleanor are there, and they're just being so bitchy to him. And I love it. Because he's talking about how much he misses Becket, and Eleanor is just kind of all like, walk it off, adult male.
We had to wait half the movie to see Eleanor and Matilda, and this is what it does with them. And these are two women who should have their own biopics, each. Matilda. Do you want to know who Matilda is?
Sure.
So Henry's mother, Matilda, was supposed to be the first queen regnant if her father, Henry I, had had his way. Henry I had a son, William, and about 20 illegitimate children. Since he and his brothers had all fought, he thought the smart thing to do is to have one legitimate male heir who can take over, and there'll be no succession battles. It'll be great. And then he has a daughter, Matilda, who he marries off to an emperor on mainland Europe. Except that then his son, William, is in the White Ship disaster, which, in terms of shipwrecks having an impact on history, it is right up there with Lusitania and Titanic. And should be more famous than it is, except that it was 900 years ago. Charles Spencer, Princess Diana's brother, wrote a book about it that is pretty good. Henry says, okay, I want my daughter Matilda to be queen. And the problem at the time is that there's never been a woman to inherit rule. There have been queens regent where they were waiting for their kid to grow up, but this has never happened before. He also has a nephew named Stephen, who has the advantage of having a penis. So Matilda and Stephen have bloody, awful civil war, and eventually the resolution reached is that her son, Henry II, will take over when Stephen died. But I'm pretty sure that Matilda's story is an inspiration behind Rhaenyra in House of the Dragon. And the one hint you get of all that is one scene where Matilda says, if only I'd been a man. Henry complains that she's this awful mother because she didn't suckle him, but the nobility had wet nurses. It was a thing for centuries. He has no reason to complain about this. And Eleanor wound up inheriting the entire Duchy of Aquitaine from her dad because her brothers kept dying. She was then married off to the King of France, who we later see played by John Gielgud, who never bothers asking after his ex. They have 2 daughters. They get a divorce. She marries Henry. Later on, Henry will put her in prison for a really long time for plotting with their sons to get rid of him, because you can see he's such a great dad. She says, I gave you children, and he says, I don't like them. I've loved Eleanor since middle school when I read a book about her called A Proud Taste for Scarlet and Miniver. It was a young adult novel by E.L. Coningsburg, who also wrote The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler. I've read a few biographies of her. I've always been fascinated by her because she was a woman who was powerful and famous. People talked trash about her. I remember the first time I went to the Louvre when I was 18, I saw this vase that I'd read about in the novel that had belonged to her, that she'd given to the abbot of Saint Denis, that was in her trousseau set. It was the most stunning thing to me that this thing that was in somebody's batch of wedding gifts that they held 900 years ago was there in front of me. That was sort of amazing. Both of these women, who have deep, rich, fascinating stories, are just consigned to being these shrews on the side, because this is really about the suppressed homosexual themes between Henry and Becket.
Indeed. So they tell him, yeah, you just got a message loud and clear from your new Archbishop of Canterbury, because he sent a messenger to tell you, and no, we're going to hold people responsible for this because God. I just have note after note here that's just, where did this come from? He took this job and all of a sudden he's in the cult of Christian faith so hard. He also at this point gives Henry back his king ring. And you knew this was coming as soon as they talked about his king ring and the fact that he can't have 2 different rings pledging loyalty to 2 different things. And Beckett's all, I'm with the church now. And then we go into an intermission, which, bless, why don't movies still have these?
That sounds delightful. I want to talk about the ridiculous purple outfit that one of the bishops is wearing. It's like this purple hood that fits all the way over his head so that you just see his round face and enormous eyebrows. And then it goes down into a purple cape and a purple gown. And he looks ridiculous.
Yes, he looks like you've seen Fruit of the Loom commercials, right? From the days where the guy who is the grape and had his face just in a grape hoodie. That's what he looks like.
Yeah, he looks absurd. What I would say about Beckett's conversion is that there is no zealotry like the zealotry of the recent convert, but he becomes really boring after. I find religion boring. I find piety very boring.
He seems to have all of the passion for religion, as one might at a job where you're I guess I'm a priest now, and this is what I signed up for. I'm also responsible for running my company's social media accounts. It just seems like he's well, it's part of my job description to be super religious, so I'm about to do that for you. There's no real passion in it, though. We come back from intermission, and Henry's basically saying, like, we got to frame Becket for a crime. And so they decide they're going to frame him and arrest him for embezzlement of church money. And Henry is doing this, but also feeling incredibly sorry for himself, because Becket is the only friend he's had, and he takes a shit on the 4 or 5 of his children that are present in this film. I know that there were dozens, but he totally talks about how they all suck and his wife sucks, and Beckett's the only good person he knows.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. Becket does have one good line here when they tell him he's accused of embezzling 40,000 pounds from the treasury as chancellor, and Becket says, there was never that much money in the treasury when I was chancellor.
I mean, 40,000 pounds in the 12th century has to be like $1 trillion, right?
Well, at the time, it recorded that the several pounds a year that it cost Becket's parents to send him to Paris to be educated was the equivalent of a year's rent from several properties that they would have owned.
And, you know, like Roman Polanski and Woody Allen would later on, he goes to France, where all of our problematic sex pests and pedophiles are celebrated and protected. And he is in France, and he starts kind of becoming a tool of, is it Louis II?
No, this is Louis VII.
He becomes tool of Louis VII, who's saying he's very valuable for me to keep him here. Then they're going to go appeal to the Pope in Rome, and what is this, you know, this is just Italians and a real spicy meatball and pizza pie. These performances of Italians are quite broad, as Becket goes to appeal to the Pope. And eventually Henry comes to France and meets Becket on the beach at Normandy, and they get kind of to a détente where Becket is going to come back to England and be essentially forgiven, but Henry is restless over this, if you will.
Yes, it's sort of sad because Becket is reminding him of, oh, you should go take the old baths that he used to help Henry out of in the morning, and like the times that they used to have. Henry like gets mad and starts to ride away, but he calls after him, Thomas! And Henry is just bereft, and the only light you see in his face is when he's looking at Thomas. And Thomas is like hung up on God, and it sucks. And I have the note here, loving God is really boring. Holy people are boring.
It's a pretty lopsided triangle when you have the Almighty in it. You know, it's like I've dated guys who were still hung up on their ex-girlfriends before, and that's a really hard thing to get over. I can't imagine trying to fight someone for the affection of the Lord.
I can't really blame Henry, even though he is a douchebag.
And then they're back in England, and Henry too wants to declare Henry III, one of his sons, to be the next king. He wants to announce this before he's dead. Henry III's got real fail son energy to him. What was wrong with him? Was he like kicked by a mule, or what was going on there?
Well, he never does become Henry III, even if he does have him crowned. He dies young, and then Richard, who was Eleanor's favorite, comes the first in line for the throne. Henry isn't doing this out of any love for his children. It's because he wants to see if he can get on Becket's nerves, because he still LOVEs him.
And his mother is all pissy with him. And Becket, not for nothing, is pretty darn popular because he's smart and he's committed to his work. And is kind of becoming a bit of a hero. And Henry doesn't like that either. So he does the line, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?"
And you see Henry throwing a fit here, which is sort of close to those legendary mattress straw chomping fits that were described. I'm just imagining him like rolling around on the floor eating straw. And I wish the director had told Peter O'Toole to roll around on the floor and eat straw. I think that would be fun to watch.
Oh, he would have done it too because he was wasted.
And he committed hard.
He totally would have done it, especially because he was so drunk. Drunk people will do anything.
I think O'Toole does a really great job throwing this fit. And there's one scene earlier where Henry is just seeing Thomas from the balcony, and he looks out at the balcony. He's like so mad at him, but it's like he's done all of this on purpose just to get to see him one more time. The only light you see in his face, the only joy, is getting to look down at this man that he's like putting every legal recourse at his disposal into persecuting. I am in favor of handing in that priest, and I don't get what the hell the problem is beyond wanting to flex for the church.
The priest is dead. He got killed. It was handled. Like, I fight about this for the rest of time until it literally gets you killed.
And why excommunicate the guy for the kind of stuff that he and Henry had been doing up until what looked like a few weeks ago in the timeline of the film? Again, what we're seeing here is actually stuff that would have been spread out over 15 years.
But they definitely don't make that clear.
They don't. They actually show it like Becket has already been running things and they're already bros. And then Henry appoints him chancellor. And then Becket is chancellor for like the amount of time that he'd have a bandage wrapped on his hand.
Eventually, these knights either take Henry's meaning or take his orders. And they go and they set upon Becket and his John Mulaney-looking aide and stab them and kill them. And they set upon him and they're stabbing him, and then they stab Becket in the back, which made me all, is this where stabbed in the back comes from? Which I doubt is the case.
I felt bad for Brother John that he didn't get to take one good whack at the knights with the giant silver cross. But they missed an opportunity that the actual death of Becket was much gorier than this, because the final blow that hit him, one of the knives sliced off the top of his head and the skull part, and his brains splatter everywhere. As you can imagine what would happen if you remove a portion of someone's skull using a sword so that it just slices off.
Well, that wasn't very nice of them.
No, but that would have been so much more exciting than what we get here. I want to see Burton brains everywhere.
I agree, and it's very anodyne, like this stabbing. It's very civilized.
No, you're right, and I don't care as much as I would have, because Becket has been really boring since he found God, and finding God sucks.
It certainly made him a real pill. So then we come back into the present of this film. Then he goes out in front of where he's been whipped and announces to the crowd there that Becket will be made a saint and a martyr, and he will never stop looking for the real killers.
And they were having such a good time until Becket had to go and find God.
That's our movie. And before we get into some of our other things, I did want to play a little game.
Okay.
Because as we discussed up top, these guys were a couple of unprofessional douchebags who got super drunk every day at work. That was kind of their whole class of actors thing. I wonder what motivates this sometimes. I think that maybe a Laurence Olivier type seduced them and they liked it, and they spent the rest of their lives drinking to try and tamp that down. or something happened at acting school, but nevertheless, this whole class of dudes just would get hammered all the time at work. What do you think a night out in the town would be with each of these actors that I'm about to name? Richard Harris.
I have no idea.
Would you want to drink with Richard Harris?
I'm sorry, Sarah. Which one is he? He's Jared Harris's dad, right?
Yeah. I'd probably ask him a lot of questions about Jared.
Yeah, because Jared's awesome.
Okay, next one. Oliver Reed, muse of our friend Ken Russell. Oliver Reed.
What was he in?
He was in Tommy. He was in Women in Love. He played Bill Sikes in the musical of Oliver. Let me find some other things.
Is he a gin man? Like, is this something where you know the real answers about how they drank and where they went?
No, I just know that they were all alcoholics. There's no right answer to this.
Okay.
This is your opinion. Like, what do you think it would be like?
I don't know. We already know what O'Toole and Burton are like getting drunk. So I'm assuming they're all like that.
Probably like something like that.
Yeah. Well, what would you do with Oliver Reed?
With Oliver Reed would definitely, like, I think I would drink beer with him, and I think that I would want to ask him a lot of questions about working with Ken Russell.
Okay.
And I think the night would end with me dying based on the way he drank. These other guys I might not, but I think if I drank with Oliver Reed, I would absolutely die.
But it's only beer.
Yeah. He once drank 100 pints of beer in 24 hours.
How bloated did he get?
He was pretty bloated. There's another one I would definitely die before the night was over.
Who?
Rex Harrison, because he would probably murder me because he definitely murdered one of his wives.
Henry Higgins.
Yeah, not a good dude.
Oh, doesn't sound like it. You actually had words to say about John Gielgud's acting.
I think John Gielgud is a good actor. Just the performance, I was like, what? We gave this an Oscar nomination? But why? He's just kind of there. I found it to be an unexciting performance.
Yeah, I think they nominated him for being John Gielgud. That category has always been weird.
Yeah.
The best supportings.
I know how we feel about Caligula, but I would say that he made more of an impression on me in Caligula than he did in this.
Yeah. Well, he didn't bleed out in this. So who from this generation of actors would you most want to get drunk with?
It would honestly be Richard Burton.
Why?
Why? Because he just seems like he was the most charming.
Yeah.
He seems incredibly charming. O'Toole, I would have thought was charming, but then when I read more about him, it sounds like he got real dark when he drank.
Well, did you know that the woman playing Gwendolyn was O'Toole's wife at the time, Shan Phillips?
Yes, and I read that he didn't want to let her out of the house after she had a child, and also said a lot of things about her being a whore because she had boyfriends before him.
Oh. She had a life before they met. Do you want to do choice dialogue?
Sure.
I had a bit here. I thought a lot of lines in this were very good. There's the one where Henry thinks he's had a bright idea, pointing Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm suddenly very intelligent. It probably comes from making love to that French girl last night. And then this exchange between Henry and Eleanor, where she says, I gave you your children. And he says, I don't like my children. Then after getting whipped, I loved it when Henry says, I forgive you, pigs. And then Becket says, what else do I have here? One collaborates to live. One can always come to a sensible little arrangement with God. We have soldiers disguised in the crowd to encourage enthusiasm. Good occupational force must never crush, it must corrupt. Humility seems to be a little hard on the knees. Sincerity is a form of strategy just like any other. And finally, do you think, never, sire, a gentleman has better things to do?
Good lines.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any?
I did. I liked Becket at one point says, "It is here now, the supreme folly. This is its hour." I also liked King Henry had a line, "I can do nothing. I'm as useless as a woman." And then I mean, will no one rid me of this grace is a fabulous line.
Yeah. It may not be what he actually said, but that's how it's come down to us. So
Yes.
Who cares?
Yeah. I mean, it was a really, really well-written screenplay. Should we go into our rankings?
Sure.
So for outward appearances, I gave it a 6.5. They're fine. I hated that mustache. And sometimes, to me, the makeup looked very theatery. Like when we met Henry III, the fail son, their way of conveying him being sickly was to put him in almost like a white clown makeup cast.
For outward appearances, I gave it a 7. It was perfectly acceptable hair and makeup for the time with nothing really remarkable going on.
Acting and casting, I gave it a 9. The acting is very good. It's an interesting style of acting. The through line of this movie for me was that it felt like I was watching a play. Like it felt like the actors were projecting as they might in the theater. There was not a film level examination of their inner lives or, as much sort of like happening in close up. It was very setty. But I thought that the acting for that was very good. Do they capture the spirit of the people they are playing? I don't fucking know. But I did very much appreciate that the acting was very good and by the best at it.
I also gave it a 9 for acting. We don't know beyond descriptions that only scholars read what these people were like. We know Henry had a temper, but I thought the performances were all excellent for what was required, and it's a different acting style than we see now. It's older, it's more stage-inspired, and with this older acting style, it's something where you need to have seen a lot of these movies from that time because it's not like what would come in with the method. So it's sort of a kind of mental space you have to evolve to, but I enjoy it.
Passage of time, I gave that a 4. There's a significant amount of time passing in this film, and I am given very little to work with to indicate that. It's just because I kind of know, as a lot of people do, that it takes a while to get somewhere on a boat. It takes a while to rouse an army before telephones and the internet, things like that. I gather that time is probably not moving as quickly as it feels like, but they didn't give me a whole lot to work with to understand that.
Yes, Passage of Time I also gave a 4, in part because what they're showing happened over a much longer period than it feels like, but also you don't really know. And also, wasn't that little boat that Brother John Mulaney and Richard Burton and 2 other guys are on look like a toy? It looks like a little toy Viking boat that you'd put out onto like that pond at Central Park.
Yeah, I'm going nowhere on that boat. Costuming, I gave it a 7 and read the note. It seemed solid. but I know you have some insights on this to share.
So I gave it an 8. I think things look authentic to an idea of the time. It's really gorgeous. And this is the first work that we're seeing by one of the OGs of costume design, Margaret First. Someday we will get to Anne of 1,000 Days. Then I will give a 10 for costuming, because Margaret First did some amazing work where even 50 years later, items that she made for period films will still turn up occasionally, because that's how gorgeous and well-made they were. But this isn't Margaret First's best work. And this is something that I care about, and not a lot of people other might, but the headdress styles the woman shown wearing were like 200 years early. That's like putting people in 90s stuff when they're supposed to be in the 70s in Gia, but it's 200 years instead of 20. Margaret First is like a better designer than whoever did that, but it's still off. And she gets away with it because nobody cares, but I do.
Okay. Quality of the script, I gave it an 8.
I gave it a 9. I loved the dialogue. It sounds like we were just ragging on this film, but I loved the style and wit and construction of the dialogue.
Yeah, we're going to get to this in accuracy, which I gave a 5 because I felt like, based on everything that you shared and just a perusal of the IMDb trivia section, you come to realize that there's a lot of dramatic license taken, both in terms of compacting of things that we don't care about, like how many children people have, because who gives a shit? But just some of the things that were taken license of in terms of like the Saxon Norman business and everything. I do feel like there were things that were pulled together to make this more of a fable than it might have been at the actual time that this was all taking place. But that said, the script was very good.
For accuracy, I gave it a 3. It was more accurate than The Conqueror, but these aren't the people that I loved in history.
For storytelling, was it cliched, interesting, inventive? I give it a 6.5. It was fine, but it was in a very conventional lane. The passage of time business was not really well conveyed. We don't know what motivated him to become so pious and religious, besides the fact that he wanted to do his job well.
There's no good reason for him to be into any of that, except that it's the Middle Ages and everyone is worried about going to hell. For storytelling, I gave it a 7.
Production value, I gave it an 8. It was a good looking movie, and it on a $3 million budget, and I know it was $3 million in 1963 money, which makes it like $1 trillion. That money was on the screen, and it was in the performances and in the sets and the design, and I thought it was a nice movie to look at.
Yes, those are 2 actual castles from around the time period that they're filming in. It was shot on location. That isn't the real Canterbury Cathedral that they used. I also gave an 8 for production value, even though that boat did look kind of rinky-dink. It was almost cute, little boat. I was surprised that Burton and O'Toole could handle the horses at all.
I was terrified for them on those horses.
I get not using the real Canterbury Cathedral because this is the 12th century, and I liked it that they found a more Romanesque looking cathedral to shoot in rather than shooting in one that was in the high Gothic style. Do you know what I'm talking about, Sarah?
Nope.
Romanesque is the style that precedes Gothic. So the walls are thicker, the walls are more load-bearing, the arches are rounded, the columns are round. Gothic was actually invented by a buddy of Eleanor's but Siege of Saint-Denis. So if you ever go to Saint-Denis, where all of the French royals were buried, until a bunch of shitty revolutionaries fucked everything up, and you can still see it, but they threw everyone into a mass grave. Anyway, Gothic is pointy arches. There are the flying buttresses outside that hold the walls up, and the windows are the stained glass, because since you've transferred the weight, you can have more window, and the rim vaulting forms a point. But since cathedral construction takes a really long time, and was recent enough that Eleanor was a friend with the guy who first thought of a bunch of things that are part of it, it makes sense for them to use a cathedral in the previous style.
Got it.
You can cut that if I was very boring, Sarah.
No, I
love this stuff so much.
I was just trying to think, do I know anything about anything this much? And I don't think I do. Do you want to hear about the paper I wrote about Animal House in college?
So, if it helps, I don't think I could identify a photo of Jim Jones.
No, you totally could.
What race was Jim Jones?
He was white and he wore sunglasses.
I don't know that.
You'd know him if you saw him, I promise.
I don't think I would.
Production and direction decision making. I gave that an 8.
I did too. They made good decisions about what to do with who, where. And they couldn't help it that Burton's character got boring later, because religious people are just boring.
The fact that they brought the film in completed, and that it is a lesser known masterpiece, but it's recognized in that vertical, that they brought it in on time and on budget.
It's remarkable that they managed to pull that together on time and on budget and well performed, with the train wrecks who couldn't put a ring on in the leading roles.
Imagine what would have been possible if they didn't dedicate so much of their energy to abusing alcohol. Because I'm not one of those people who believes that excessive use of substances actually makes art better. I think that working hard makes art better, but what could they have done if they actually behaved like people who cared about their jobs?
They still made some pretty great films anyway.
They totally did, but if this was them drunk and on the drunk autopilot, then what could they have accomplished if they had been responsible? And I'm being a fuddy-duddy. I'm not being fun. And then Do We Care? I gave it a 6, but I also know this was not for me. This was a movie made for you. It's just that Sarah doesn't care.
Yeah, I gave it a 9 because, I did care about these somewhat star-crossed would-be lovers who are not Henry and any woman that he has seen with, including his wife. And this is a time that I have loved reading about for decades now. So I love being immersed in that time. I love trash talking the inauthentic Hennons. You're right. This is a movie made for me because I am all about the frock flick.
It was a really well done frock flick.
My average came to 7.2. I guess that that accuracy score pulled it down. And it was gonna do that with me because the film that I really want isn't Becket. The two movies that I really want to watch are the Eleanor biopic and the Matilda biopic, and they haven't been made. And that's why this got a 7.2, I think, because the people that I cared most about weren't given their due. It's a Rena thing. Even though, yes, I loved Peter O'Toole in this. I'm loving him in everything. And because they were British guys who did a lot of prestige picks. We're going to be seeing more and more O'Toole, and we're going to be seeing a lot of Burton.
Burton plays a king like every other movie.
We're going to see him in Cleopatra. We're going to see him in an Alexander the Great picture. And we're going to see someone playing him when we get to Liz and Dick with Lindsay Lohan.
God, give me strength. I had a 6.8.
Well, 7.2 and 6.8 on average are 7. And I feel bad for giving a 7 to a film that is in the National Registry. What's wrong with us?
Well, it was inaccurate.
And I'm someone who's going to dock for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was passage of time and accuracy, and that since we're looking at these as biopics, not as overall films, that's why.
Yeah, so it's okay. It's okay for us to not like be obsessed with a thing.
Yeah.
National Film Registry, I'm sure, is paternalistic AF. And they're like, this is the most important story that we could tell about the foundation of Great Britain, and you respectfully disagree.
I'm a hardcore Anglophile, and like I've said, I am way more interested in 970 than I am in 1970. This just wasn't treated in a way that rooted me to my seat. But that's okay.
It is. It is. So with that, if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Frida, starring Salma Hayek as Frida Kahlo. Speaking of paternalism, it was hard to find a biography written for grown-ups about Frida Kahlo. She has a ton of children's books. I had to go to the Queen's Library to find an ebook of the bio that Salma Hayek used. Also, this was produced by 90s Miramax, which means Harvey Weinstein was involved.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, he was a real scumbag about it, too.
Yeah, he was a real scumbag to Salma Hayek.
But which, not a surprise. Also, this features difficult Edward Norton coming in and helping to finish the movie, if I recall correctly. I haven't done my research on this yet, but I have seen many adorable little golden books for children about Frida Kahlo, which is interesting because I feel like her life isn't necessarily for children.
No. I guess that's it. Thank you for tuning in.
We'll see you next week. Good night, Rena.
Good night, Sarah.